Thanks for coming back and not going to take a nap, which is what feels more appropriate. My favorite part of NACIS is seeing how people do things, getting a peek at process, and also this cross-pollination of ideas. So my niche is hand-drawn and painted cartography, and so I'm going to show you some things that you're probably already doing in Illustrator and Photoshop and how I might do them on paper. First off, I want to pitch Watercolor as a great tool for transparent effects. This is a map I made at Barton Creek near Austin, Texas, where I live. And the author really wanted to show that while everybody knows about Barton Springs Pool, way down near the mouth of the creek to the east of the map, near Austin, really in downtown Austin, there's 40 miles of creek upstream with a lot of important conservation areas. Here's the pool. It's a 68-degree constant cold spring-fed pool in Austin, and everybody knows it, but just this is looking upstream. There's another 40 miles. So here in this detail, I'm trying to show that Barton Springs Pool there on the east is part of the Barton Creek Greenbelt, which is shown in the dark green with the outline. It's also, of course, part of the Barton Creek watershed, even though the creek's diverted at that point so that the pool can remain spring-fed. And it's also fed by the Edwards Aquifer Recharge Zone, which is that blue coming up from the south. So using Watercolor, I'm able to show all those things at once, like you would in Illustrator or Photoshop using transparent effects. This is a setup for a map I made for the NACIS River, some conservation areas along the NACIS River in East Texas. And the author's point here was that this is a really patchworky landscape area with some clear cuts, some national forests, some national wildlife refuge, a lot of private land, and conservationists are trying to stitch together property along the river to preserve. So using all those land cover ideas, I drew on Watercolor. That's to the right is a Winslow Homer painting that uses, you look at it and you read a landscape, but it's really made up of yellows, blues, greens, browns, all of those creating a dappled effect to read as landscape. So to build those things, we need to know a little bit about paint characteristics, one of which is transparency, which is just like the thing you're familiar with, but showing those on the left, this isn't really in order, but the examples on the left are very transparent paints. The manganese blue is blue I use a lot. It's light and transparent. You can layer it up as much as you want. The cerulean right next to it is a granulating paint. So granulation is another quality of watercolor paints. That's when the pigment's actually settling out of the paint, and it gives you that crunchy texture. And I think of that as akin to noise in Photoshop. If you want to add some noise or texture, you can choose granulating pigments. And then there are staining and lifting qualities to different paints. So the more transparent paints, and some of the crunchy ones too, you're able to lift them out. You can re-wet the surface and actually lift them out with a dry brush or with a paper towel. But staining paints like the phthalo blue on the far right, once you paint them down, you're not going to get them to come back up, so you better be happy with that decision. And these are just some greens that I built out of the yellows and blues on the previous slide, so you can see what a variety of landscape colors you can get by combining just, this is just 2 paints, and then you can keep going and going. I'm showing a overlying green stripe on the bottom, which I often do an overlayer at the end of a painting just to kind of unify the landscape, and so it looks more cohesive. So let's talk about this NACIS River map and the process that I used. I first started with the lightest yellows and some ochre yellows, then added the blues, and then I used at least 2 different types of greens to show some of the pasture land and the forested land. And I added some burnt sienna to tone that state forest near the bottom. And you can add different paints on the top, like cadmiums or cobalts, that add some of the textured quality. And on this, I did use I did probably 2 layers at least of overlying washes on top of all of that to get it to hang together. So I wanted to talk about masking, which has been touched on by several people today. This is what I'm using when I'm masking. Masking fluid is a liquid, rubbery fluid that you can paint or draw on, and it gets rubbery when it's dry. It's also known as frisket, and it will ruin your paint brushes, so use inexpensive brushes or tag them frisket like I do. That tool on the bottom is a ruling pen. You can pick up a thick or a thin amount of masking fluid with that, and that's how I drew the state lines of Texas for this map. So back to the Neches River, you can see on the left, I started with the lightest yellow underpainting, and then I painted on the frisket, which is the orangey sort of tone that you see in the clear-cut areas and the roads. From then I painted, I don't know, probably 30 layers in different parts of the map of different blues, greens, sienna, and more yellowish tones to build up that rich landscape, look. And then on the right is when I peeled the mask off, it leaves those clear cuts as being the light areas there. So unlike in Photoshop, where it sort of magically doesn't let you touch anything beneath, here you have to actually peel up the physical masking layer that you've applied earlier on. This is another example that I like to use masking with orthogonal, kind of boring street grids, because it lets me quickly add some more texture and interest to the maps. So, sorry. Andy was kind enough to send me his slides before, because we were talking about how, we're really cross-platforming from web cartography to hand-drawn techniques. So I'm getting in on his game and showing my home state of Texas with some interglow techniques. So this is sped up, but this is a quick go at making an interglow. I'm just picking up pigment. I can move quickly because I've painted in those state lines as a mask already, so I don't have to fuss too much about what's going on there. I'm trying to keep moving and keeping everything wet, and then just using plain water to draw that pigment in toward the center. And you can see here I wasn't successful in keeping those edges wet, so I'm scrubbing, re-wetting and scrubbing and softening up that pigment edge. So even though there's not a Command Z in doing this, there are ways to get around your mistakes or your lack of speed. And since everything's wet at this point, I can just drop in more pigment where I want. And then I can lift up pigment, that's just a crumpled paper towel you saw, just dabbing in wet pigment and lifting it off the page before it dries. So another way to get a glow effect, which I saw with some maps earlier today, is applying a stroke and then doing a glow off of that. So here I'm using a reed pen, which holds a lot of ink and will give me a thick stroke, and that's Blue India ink. And believe it or not, with the brush, I've come in with a plain, clear water. And that wet brush touches the wet ink, and it's drawing that pigment right out into the gulf. And then I'm just going to come in with more clear water and kind of dilute it as it goes out to the gulf. And then I'm going to tip it up, because you can see the pigment wants to bleed out to the wet area, and I want it to stay back by the coast. So that's how I'm limiting the direction of that paint. And like I said, this is where I want to physically lift up the mask. So you just use a rubber block, a rubber cement block, and peel up the kind of snotty masking fluid, and it leaves those crisp lines. And then I went back in with a pen nib and more of that India ink and drew the rivers in. And it, it's a quick map, but it sort of nicely shows how all of Texas drains from the plains in the north and the west down to the Gulf. So I started thinking about this talk last year when Jim Aynard was talking about drafting axonometric maps in Illustrator. He called them pseudo 3D maps or axonometric maps. And I thought, well, I do that all the time on paper. It'd be fun to kind of compare them. And his quote that I wrote down from last year was, "Wireframe is your friend," which is also the case when I'm doing the same on paper. I'm just starting with a building footprint. I chose a church with a nice form in Austin. And you can do the math and get the building heights if you want, but I'm just kind of eyeballing things. And since north is a societal construct, as we know, I'm aligning my grid to 60-30 degree angles because buildings look nice at that angle. So you just lift the vertical, using vertical lines, you just lift the roof plane up off of the footprint, just exactly like Jim showed, which you can see on NACIS's YouTube channel from last year's talk by Jim Aynard. Just lift it right up off of the building footprint. And that includes the dome. I kind of guessed where the dome would be in the floor plan and then use vertical lines and lift it straight up to the roof line. Then when you've built your wireframe, it's really fun to add more tracing paper. And I'm just inking over and adding little capitals and bases to those columns and adding some detail and doodads. When we get to the drum of the dome is round on top, but the drum of it is made out of vertical walls that the drum sits on, so those are all vertical lines. And everything in an axonometric drawing, everything that's parallel in life stays parallel in this drawing. So it's not a perspective drawing, it's things that are parallel stay parallel. So they're easy to construct. And that's what I have for you today. And I'd love for people to, thanks. I'd love it if people would find me and talk about the ways that you think you could do these things, or the ways that you do these things. And if you have any ideas for me, I'd love to hear it. Thanks.